On average, it takes 17 years for something that's considered to be an innovation to be considered to be in mainstream use in the NHS. In a world of agentic AI, in a world of advanced general intelligence, who's actually responsible for care? We haven't yet, I think, squared the circle about, so who's legally responsible for these decisions that are being made? Safety is one of the first things that people bring up. But nobody ever asks the question of how safe are we right now?
Welcome to The Digital Forge, the podcast where we explore how technology, innovation and people are reshaping industry and the future of this region. I'm David Richards. My guest today is Richard Stubbs, Chief Executive of Health Innovation Yorkshire and Humber, one of the organisations created by NHS England to help bridge the gap between healthcare, academia, industry and innovation. Richard has spent more than 2 decades inside the NHS, but his work now stretches far beyond hospitals and healthcare delivery. He sits at the intersection of health, economic growth, AI, regional leadership and national policy. He is a member of the NHS Assembly, has advised NHS England on innovation strategy, served as chair of the National Health Innovation Network, and now sits on the MHRA National Commission into regulation of AI in healthcare. He has also recently accepted a chair role with the World Health Organization, helping design a forthcoming European-wide public health innovation platform, alongside roles with Westfield Health and Sheffield Theatres. He has become one of the strongest advocates for the idea that health is not simply a public service issue, it's an economic issue. Richard argues that if Britain wants growth, productivity and prosperity, it must first tackle poor health, inequality and the future to adopt innovation. He believes Yorkshire has the ingredients to become one of the world's leading health innovation regions, and he believes that the NHS is approaching a moment where it either transforms through technology and systems redesign or becomes financially and operationally unsustainable. Before we begin, please follow The Digital Forge on Spotify, Apple Podcasts or YouTube so you never miss an episode. Richard, welcome.
Hi, Dave. Hi, David.
I've got to say, I've been trying to get you on this podcast for a few months now, and I'm delighted that you've agreed to come. But let's start with where it all started for you. I know you're originally from Maltby and from a mining family. Just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, of course. Confession time. Actually born in Essex, which is, as Mr. Yorkshire is career limiting, let's say.
You cheat, you were born in Essex.
Let's skirt over that. Yeah, I mean, I come from a mining background, as you say. I come from a Maltby mining background. My dad happened to be working in the Vauxhall factory down in Luton when I was born. So it was a small blip in an otherwise seamless Yorkshire trajectory. But yes, I was hastily brought back to the motherland pretty quickly. But yeah, there goes my Yorkshire credentials.
So you were sort of, it was an
anomaly.
It was just an anomaly.
It was an anomaly.
It was just happenstance that happened to be born there.
The only thing that mattered was, I think, technically I couldn't have played cricket for Yorkshire at the time. I think that rule was in place. But yes, let's quickly, seamlessly brush over that fact. So yes, grew up in Maltby, obviously not too far from here in Sheffield. Classic working class mining town. 3 generations of miners before me, and I was the first one of my generation not to go down the pit. Although for most of my upbringing, that was definitely the destination. That was the place you worked in Maltby. So it took a while before the paths diverged.
So for many people who are from mining communities, it's sort of predetermined that you're going to go down the pit and become a miner. Was that ever the case with you?
Well, it was certainly, I think, my dad's perspective was, of course, it was a good job, it was a stable job, it's a secure job. Given the background, the Stubbses came from County Durham in the 1920s when the pit shaft was sunk. There was that kind of sense of there's a job for you here when you're ready for it. So without a doubt, I think from my dad's perspective, that was always the way. I think my mum, who was a nurse, but from Jamaica, had very different ideas. And you can see who won in the balance of power. So I definitely trod a different path. But I think if I had gone with my default trajectory, I would have been down the pit from the early 90s.
So obviously your parents, particularly, it sounds like your mother, really valued education. Was education important to them?
Education was really important to my mum. I think she was somebody who would say that education was the thing that lifted her in her career. She finished her career as an executive director of nursing in the NHS.
Wow.
She did a phenomenal amount of things in her time. And actually Sheffield Hallam, then the Polytechnic, was instrumental in terms of where she did her degree, where she did her master's degree, and that was kind of her own launch pad. So, we talk, don't we, about universities being places of social mobility. Mum is an absolute classic case study of that.
So was your mum first generation?
Yes, first generation. So she came across from Jamaica. She left step-parents, parents, 5 siblings who all over time emigrated to America. So I'm now the kind of Hugh Grant of the family in terms of my cousins. But she came over here by herself to study to be a nurse in the NHS and remained ever since.
And how did your parents meet then? I'm sorry, we're going completely off topic.
We are. This is interesting. So they met, I think she was studying at Doncaster. Right. Or maybe even Rotherham, but certainly South Yorkshire. And they met. I think the rest of the details are hazy. I should go and inquire, shouldn't I? But certainly they met while she was training in South Yorkshire, and Dad was obviously still knocking around Maltby.
Wow. Interesting. And I know we're going to talk a little bit about Orgreave, and when you see what, the MRC now on that site, that must mean something very different to you when you look at that.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up, obviously I think I was 8 years old when the miners' strike happened. I remember it very, very vividly. I don't think I really, really understood it, but I remember the violence in particular. I remember the donkey jackets. I remember the strange things that happened during that time. Lots and lots of strange things. Lots and lots of noises on phone lines and things like that. I can still recall all those kind of strange things, but particularly Orgreave, and particularly the stories my dad tells me about, fighting, policemen and police horses in Orgreave. I suppose the alleged timing of who charged first, all those kind of things. Very, very much part of my upbringing. And yet now, yes, driving along the Parkway and often chairing meetings on the Advanced Manufacturing Park, thinking this was a battleground where bricks were being hurled at state police officers by my dad and his mates. It's very surreal.
Well, what's interesting now, and we've seen this with Hillsborough, the Hillsborough disaster, and other things that happened around that time in the UK, and we still haven't really got to the bottom of what happened at Orgreave. I mean, I know you're 8 years old, but these things live with you, I think, for quite a while. I was at Hillsborough when the Hillsborough disaster happened, actually, and it is. I mean, it's not criticising the police today, but back then there clearly was something going on. I mean, do your family still sort of hold that close to them? Do they still think, we were goaded into doing this? And, when you look at some of the evidence now, it's pretty apparent, let's face it, that the police caused this incident to happen.
It still resonates. I think it's still important for people. I think our regional mayor, Oliver, I think speaks often on this in terms of the fact that the region is perhaps still going through some kind of process. Yeah. And I think he's absolutely right that perhaps for those of us who've lived here our entire lives, we perhaps don't understand it as much because we're probably it's too close in our vision. But certainly, I think moving beyond that era, I think is something which is going to take a societal conversation, a societal shift, and maybe it will be something like the Orgreave inquiry that just provides some level of closure. But it's still very raw and real.
To what extent do you think that backdrop in your life actually shapes you moving forward? Because it is, for a society, it is trauma. It does stay with you, doesn't it? Situations like that. And
what's really interesting to me is that when I was growing up, even despite the miners' strike, despite the relative, I suppose, lack of affluence that was around me, life was normalized. I think when you're a kid growing up, wherever you're growing up, your world is your normal.
Yeah.
And it really, for me, wasn't until perhaps, going to university, certainly starting to work. But I went to university at the University of York, and all of a sudden I was surrounded by some great friends, but, private schools from Edinburgh, private schools from Coventry. My house is in Richmond, but actually that's Richmond, West London. And you started, I think, to really recognise difference. And I think that was very interesting. And it wasn't a jealousy, but it was certainly a notion that there's difference. And therefore, there's perhaps different starting places for people. And I think that was particularly true when I started to move into the media, and how I got particularly interested in how people get to where they get to rather than what they do when they get there.
Yeah, sort of decoding how you achieve something, because there is a methodology to it, I suppose, isn't there? Just before we move on to your career and how you got to university, which is the most fascinating story. During that period of the miners' strike, we saw a lot of people, a lot of families struggling to put food on the table, actually to survive. I mean, obviously, your mum was a professional, but certainly people within your community must have been struggling. You must have seen real deep poverty around that time.
Yeah, you did. And I think it was, again, something that was perhaps became slightly normalized in terms of that. And it's only really when you can look back. But the stories that you hear, the stories that my dad would tell, men going off to hunt deer on Lord Scarborough's estate or whatever it may be, trying to steal a cow, just things that just became the way that you survived. I mean, I think, and my parents may disagree, but, I feel we would have been slightly insulated due to the fact that, mum was a professional, she had a job.
Yeah.
But even I remember, to my absolute horror now looking back, but, crying at the Christmas presents that I got, Christmas that year, because, I probably wanted the Transformer. I didn't get the Transformer, but, so, first world problems, definitely. But certainly I think, as I say, that was life growing up. And it wasn't really until you moved outside that bubble that you realize how quite desperate some of those times were.
Just talking about it now, it literally feels like it's a completely different planet, doesn't it? I mean, you can't even imagine blokes having to go off and steal cows or hunt deer or whatever just to eat. I mean, this is crazy, absolutely crazy. So how did you get into the University of York then? You've obviously did really well at school. You're obviously...
I was pretty smart.
Yeah.
I was pretty smart. So I did well at school. That was, I think, the big thing for me. I was always somebody who achieved well at school. I was, I think, lucky to be, fairly academic. So that was great. I actually got into the University of York to do something that I was desperate to do. So politics, philosophy and economics. I actually applied to Oxford. I had no chance of getting to Oxford. The school, my comprehensive school just weren't set up to help. They just didn't.
But you had that ambition.
Yeah.
Good for you. I mean, wow. Did you do the entrance exam and all of that?
I did the interview.
Yeah.
I did the interview. I had no idea. So I applied to Christchurch College because the prize had to be visited. I just didn't understand the differences between the colleges where state school kids may have a better chance than others. This is all stuff that you get the kind of guidebook later.
Yeah.
It was a good day out. But to be honest, I was really happy at York. And yeah, I think by that time in my life, I think mum's educational academic kind of path had been set. And I think one of the differences between me and perhaps not all, but some of my classmates in the comprehensive school growing up in Maltby was, by the time I got to my early teens, I just knew I was going to university. Yeah. It was non-negotiable. It was just, that's the next thing that you do. And I think without that certainty, I perhaps would have then gone into a different career path entirely.
What did your peer group do? What did your mates do? Did they do the same thing as you?
Some of them done really well and gone into university. I think a lot of them have stayed very local and, doing well. I think one of the things that's really interesting to me, and I know we'll talk about this, but now I'm involved in what is now the Multi Academy Trust for my old comprehensive school and junior school back in the Pit Village. The sons and daughters of my year group are the kind of going through school now, so that's quite funny to me to see that actually who stayed, who's gone, and how those paths have diverged over time, let's say.
It must be important for them because one of the big things is to know you can do something, you have to kind of be able to see it. So because you're from that community originally, they can see what can be achieved, everything you've achieved, but you are from the same place that they're from. That must be important to them.
I would hope so. And I think it's one of the real reasons why I do the schools job.
Yeah.
Is actually, yes, there's something about the governance and helping, but actually, hopefully being a bit of a role model, hopefully saying, actually, you can achieve. And actually, you don't have to be too far away to do that. So I think there's something about, go to London, go to New York, go to wherever, but actually, you can be just down the road and doing quite well on the national scene as well. And I think that's just as important as head off and flourish.
So when you finished university, you went to work for the BBC in Manchester.
Yeah, eventually. Took me a year knocking on the door. I had no idea how to get into that place. And I naively thought that the way you did it was you waited every Monday morning for the Guardian to come out. And there was what's called the Media Guardian supplements. Open the back pages, apply to every job going, CV after CV after CV. Nothing ever worked. And actually, when I finally got in there, I realised that that's just not the way you do it. These jobs are advertised, but realistically, it's that 6 degrees of separation.
Yeah.
So after a year, we started doing that. We started, me and my mom started saying, well, we know nobody who works in telly, but who does she know? Who knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody? And eventually there was somebody at the end of that chain who said, I'll give you 4 weeks work experience. The interesting thing to me, because at some point we'll get on to...
your mum sounds phenomenal.
She is.
By the way.
She should be sat here instead of me.
Yeah.
She's absolutely phenomenal. She'd be feeding you right now if she were here. She's, Jamaican woman of a certain age. She'd be forcing food down you. But what was really fascinating to me now is that I'd come back from university. I was living at home. I was doing some work experience, all those kind of things. But I was also signing on, and I went into the job centre in Maltby, absolutely delighted. 1 week saying, "You won't believe this. I've managed to get 4 weeks work experience in Manchester." So this could be it. If I work really hard, I could have a job at the end of this. The response was, well, you're going to have to quit signing on. If you can't be here next week to sign on, you're effectively, null and void. And so you're left with that choice of, well, so now I'm going to have to get bankrolled somehow, because obviously work experience doesn't pay. I'm going to have to get to Manchester every day. But it was really fascinating to me that the state response was kind of well done for getting the opportunity, but actually, we're gonna throw something else in your path, another barrier in your path to say, actually, you're gonna have to not sign on if you can't be here on Thursdays, then that's it. I just thought that was really fascinating, because somebody else could have said, well, sort the work experience then. I need the money.
How did you work it out? What did you do?
Well, obviously, as always, mum chips in, mum gets me there. A few people can sleep on floors and do what's necessary, and then you kind of hope that something's gonna fall for you, break for you at the end of the process, which is obviously what did. I did my 4 weeks, then got offered the usual classic entry route into TV, which is to be a runner. I think I got a 6-week contract as a runner, and then you just cling on by your fingernails onto the and stay in there for as long as you can go. But I was lucky, I could make that choice. I had people like Mum who could keep me going in the meantime. But for others, they'd have made different choices. I went to Hat Trick Productions in London for an interview to do some work experience, and they said they were going to pay me a sandwich a day. That was the offer. I was like, well, I kind of need to get to central London and live in central London, and the sandwich doesn't really cover it. And I think this is back to this point about you start to realize that some people have choices and some people don't have choices.
Yeah.
We need to balance that.
Did you think before you went to university that going to university would solve all these problems, that somehow it was a golden ticket?
I don't think I did. I kind of knew it was the path.
Yeah.
But I also didn't have a clue what I wanted to do in terms of career. One of the reasons I chose PPE is because it just felt like you were just kicking the choice down the road to say, this is broad. This could lead to all sorts of different places, so that will be fine.
Usually being a prime minister, it turns out.
Yeah, scarily, or other more notable career paths. So, no, I don't think I did. I think all I knew for me was this has been given to me as the thing that you do next. And so it was just another step. but I didn't see it as some kind of amazing opportunity that's gonna, everything's gonna fall for you now that you've had this opportunity.
And it's interesting what you said, that you were looking in the Guardian to try and get a job at the BBC, but then they're just perfunctory. Right? That isn't how you get a job at the BBC. You need to know back then. I'm not saying it's like that now, but
I'm pretty sure it is like that now. I mean, it's networking is everything.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's, good for good and bad.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of my biggest life lessons, not just from the Media Guardian days, but even now in the NHS.
Yeah.
The power of networking is everything, and it can be a force for good, it can be a force for evil. It perhaps depends sometimes on what side of the fence you sat on and who's benefiting. Yeah. But it's the reality.
Yeah. How long did you stay at the BBC?
So I was there about 4 or 5 years. Loved it. Absolutely loved it.
And what jobs were you doing?
Well, everything that a runner gets to. So I started as a runner. So I did lots of TV. Manchester at the time, this was before Salford. So this was Oxford Road in Manchester. And there was a 4th floor and a 5th floor. And on the 4th floor, you made what was called entertainment features. And on the 5th floor, you did religion. So I stayed largely on the 4th floor. And so my sweet spot was, late 90s, B-C-list celebrity shows. Question of Sport was there. We did Question of Sport.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we did.
Was it David Coleman back then?
No, it was Sue Barker.
Sue Barker.
It was Sue Barker. It was Ali McCoy. It was John Parrott as the team captains. So classic Question of Sport era. But I did lots and lots of kind of celebrity-driven, music-driven things. Did a program with Maltby, although she was Mel G at the time. Did some loads and loads of daytime stuff. If you had Nick Knowles and Gabby Roslin in, then my name was somewhere on the credits. Live TV in particular, so that kind of 10 to 11 o'clock OEPs and students kind of zone. But live TV is a real proving ground. It almost had this kind of military feel to it, that something is happening, the clock is ticking, you can't alter that. You are going live in 17 minutes, and this problem has occurred, and it needs to be fixed. And I really love that.
Did anything ever go wrong?
Oh, everything always went wrong. I mean, I think with live TV, you kind of roll with it, don't you? I did loads and loads of things where things get wrong. I mean, particularly did a show in North Yorkshire, Vets in the Country. So this whole thing about children and animals is a good rule. I was once on the back of a pickup truck driving around, having to pick up ostrich eggs. And you kind of drove to one corner of the field to get these eggs while the ostriches were in the other end of the field. But of course, they saw you straight away, so they'd come running over. So you got as many eggs as you could. It's like a video game. You got as many eggs as you could, pelted to the other end of the field while they kind of arrived and then got the eggs from that end. Yeah, there's some weird and wonderful times. But yeah, live television in particular is a rite of passage.
I mean, it sounds like a phenomenal career, really interesting. What made you decide to leave?
I think because I suppose two things really. One was, the other thing that the Beeb was really good at for me, retrospectively, let's say, was this immersion into the hard knocks of small p politics. So it was a relentless life, absolutely relentless. And you had to kind of really, really love that life. It was all consuming. But also, I think it was very political, and there were, back to my point about people making choices, but there were literally people outside the front door, the Beeb every day, who would do your job for free if given the chance. So the competition was fierce, but it did teach me a lot about how you survive in that kind of world. But ultimately for me, I think having got in there, by the skin of my teeth, I didn't really have any choice about the kind of programs I made. I would have probably been better off if my 6 degrees of separation had landed me in the sports department, or probably even the news department actually, but definitely sport. I think I'd still be there now. But actually, entertainment features for me was the kind of thing where I loved the production and the challenge of this thing needs to happen. I had no real interest in the product. And so I didn't watch, I wouldn't sit down and watch the things that we made. And after a few years of kind of really enjoying the process, there was definitely a sense of me thinking, I need to do something where I actually have some pride in what I'm trying to create. And despite having a nurse for a mum, I'd actually never thought about the NHS. It was I went to see a career consultant, and they kind of taught me through what's important to me and all those kind of things. It was really useful. they're the ones who mentioned it. They had a thing called the graduate management scheme, which I'd never heard of, and so that was my entry point.
Did you ever think, because you did PPE, you're working at the BBC, did you ever think about politics?
I've thought about it, yeah. I've thought about it a lot. And a few people have mentioned it to me as well. And I can see why. I think there's a parallel universe where that was my path, I think. And I can also spot perhaps the times in my life when the sliding doors moments of where you have those opportunities. You know, we were very close to our local Labour MP, a guy called Kevin Barron.
Yeah.
In the Rother Valley constituency, you know, I knocked about with his kids, and you know, even to the point of, I remember once being at his house when Neil and Glynis Kinnock came around for tea. You know, so there was those kind of moments where you thought, oh, that could have been, you know, if I'd have been a little bit more on it as a teenager, that could have been it. But
because you've got the ingredients, right? Because you know, broadcast media.
Who wants to be a politician?
Well, exactly.
I mean, if you told me that you could do a job where you could serve the country in a discipline where you had a level of expertise in it, you got remunerated properly, and your family weren't subject to public scrutiny, then I think I'd bite your hand off. But so much of that isn't true.
Yeah. They get for, what is it, 60 grand a year or something? I mean, it's a disgrace.
I think it's a little bit more now, but you know, you have to, you know, down to London on a Monday if you're lucky, back on a Thursday if you're lucky, surgeries on a Friday and a Saturday. Every 4 years, the voters get to decide, maybe in less than 4 years. And you know, there's a litany of ex-MPs. I think second chamber, upper chamber, you know, that could, now you're talking.
All right, okay, okay. Well, you know the right people.
Well, you know.
I wish politics had more people like you in it that actually have expertise and have a background where you understand how society works, rather than going to Eton, Oxbridge, and I'm not, you know, not, or it could be any university, and then just saying, right, I've done student politics, so now I'm going to go run the country. I mean, come on, seriously. Do you just go back to the BBC? The BBC's now comes in for a lot of criticism, a hell of a lot of criticism, particularly on news and this woke stuff that it's been accused of. How do you, as somebody that worked at the BBC and now out of the BBC, how do you see it?
I think the BBC is a really important institution, and it absolutely needs to be protected and valued. And actually, as somebody who's had a career in the BBC and a career in the NHS, those two organisations are pretty similar. You know, 3-letter acronyms that are loved by the most of the society in this country. You know, tax funded in different ways, but ultimately both at risk. And I think with both institutions, if they ever disappear, that's when we'll realise how good they were. But you know, in terms of the media, the neutrality of the BBC is everything. And in an era of fake news, in an era of AI manipulation, having a journalist content that you can trust, I think is super important. And even, you know, this sounds a bit pompous, but you know, from at a global level, you know, having something like the BBC for the world is really important.
I lived in the US for 23 years, and I never listened to US. I couldn't trust US news. I would only listen to the BBC, and we still listen to the Today program. My wife would only listen to BBC stuff. So our children grew up only watching the BBC. And I agree with you. I think if you turn it into, if you start saying, well, it's, you know, I'm paying for Netflix, I should pay for the BBC, or the BBC should move to some sort of, you know, non-licensed fee subscription base, I think it's dangerous. I really do.
It really is.
It's good to hear that. It's good to hear somebody that's worked there and looking at it from the outside still believes how important it actually is. So you went to work for the NHS. How did you get in?
So this thing called the Graduate Management Scheme, I'd never heard of it. It was probably still the best 2 years of my professional life. Heavily contested. Very lucky to get in. There were about 65 people, I think, chosen nationally every year at the time, but it's increased now. But it basically was like a fast track management course. It gave you 2 years in different jobs in the NHS, and I saw it as a passport. You know, it was a passport to kind of go and explore. And one of the best things it did was it gave you, the first 3 months, you actually just spent your time shadowing every single person who works in the NHS. Everyone talks about the days that you spend with the porters. That is by far and away the time when you find out most about how the NHS actually works. But being in the front of an ambulance, working with people who spend all their day running a morgue in a children's hospital, is incredibly humbling. And I think you just don't understand what it takes to run the NHS and the people behind the NHS. So yeah, it was great. And as a general management program, it's still something that I kind of refer back to now in terms of the lessons that I learned on that program.
Are you pleased you left the BBC to join the NHS?
I am, actually. I had no idea that the NHS was going to be so good to me. I've had a pretty unique career, which we'll talk about in the NHS, but I found it a place where you can absolutely flourish. But I should say, I don't think I would have really flourished in the NHS if it hadn't been for my BBC training, if you like. The stuff that I'd kind of been had been injected into me almost on a subconscious level. As the first job, you kind of just thought this is how you operate, and bringing that kind of sensibility into the NHS, I thought was this is the hindsight kind of realization, but
yeah.
You kind of realize that I came in with a little bit of a live TV, let's make this happen kind of approach to life, and it serves you well.
So how quickly did you move up the ranks? What sort of jobs did you do to get?
So the graduate scheme's 2 years, and after that you kind of come out of that and you do kind of classic graduate management, postgraduate management jobs. So lots of general management in hospitals. Actually, my first proper job was in Donny at Doncaster and Bachelor Hospital. Did about 4 years in Doncaster, and I'd say that was pretty much usual trajectory. One of the interesting things about the NHS as a manager is that you are kind of still expected to want to be a hospital chief exec. That's the kind of the top of your particular peak. I was never really interested in that. I didn't know what I wanted to do within the NHS, but I knew that wasn't it for me. So after 4 years at Doncaster, that's when I think my career really started to accelerate, and it did it because I kind of found my way into national programs and politics, and again started saying yes to some really random stuff, and took a bit of a risk actually.
So one of your primary roles is in technology,
Yeah.
and having now returned to this country, I think the NHS is fabulous, critically important, but it also feels to me like it is creaking. We were discussing off camera before about we're going to get into artificial intelligence and some other things, but you've talked about innovation inside the NHS not being primarily a technology problem but an implementation problem. What do you mean by that?
We don't put enough resource and attention into how you actually get things to scale. So I think one of the things in my career, particularly maybe me 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I was kind of looking for the lever that you pull to make stuff happen. It didn't feel like it was in a hospital really. And I started to get into kind of national jobs and particularly close to ministers and ministerial offices. And you felt that somewhere there's going to be a big room with a big lever, and you kind of pressed it, and stuff started to happen. And I think American companies coming over, tech companies or others, you could be in the room with a minister and them, and the minister would say quite rightly, "This is great. Whatever it is you're showing me, super, get it, understand the value proposition." And the tech company would walk out of the room thinking, great, that's it.
We've got a deal.
60 million patients. And then you kind of have to explain to them, look, there's really no such thing as the NHS. There's kind of like 500, 600 separately governed, separately managed, fairly autonomous organizations. Each one of them has to say, yes, we will. And so the mechanism of how you actually get change to happen is really complicated. And actually it's kind of a culture job. But we don't really lean into it hard in the NHS, I'd say. I think we're getting better. But I suppose my argument is that we spend a lot of time inventing stuff, and we're great. The NHS has invented some phenomenal things, globally transformational stuff. But very few people think about, so how does this happen everywhere all at once?
Is there a fix to that problem? Is there... What needs to change so that you can... So here's a bit of technology. We know the impact of this is going to be this. We can prove it. We'll maybe do a little prototype program here. How do you fix that problem?
Yeah.
Is there a fix to that problem?
I think there is, but I think it also requires tackling some grey areas that politicians in particular, I think, have ducked in the past. So one of the things I talk about is no matter what policy argument you're having in the NHS, you're really usually talking about the difference between national and local.
Yeah.
And I think as a politician, you would want to say in the same breath, it is the National Health Service, that N is really important. But then you would also want to actually acknowledge the fact that decisions are made locally by the people closest to the patients. And therefore, it's absolutely important there's a devolution of power, devolution of decision making. But actually what you're also talking about there is postcode lottery, because you're saying that actually by giving the power to clinicians and commissioners on the ground, they're going to make a different decision in Barnsley than they might make in Bradford.
Yeah.
Right decision for their patients. All this stuff is done in the best interest of patients. But ultimately, if you're sat there at the centre saying everybody should use this thing, then actually we need to think about, well, isn't that mandated? Shouldn't we be thinking about mandation for some particular types of technology or pathway change? But to do that kind of destroys the local decision making. So you kind of got that balance and that tension. It's not mutually exclusive, but I think we have to be a bit more honest about some of those choices and about how mandation from a central point of view is going to maybe erode some local decision making.
Yeah, you've just made me think. I went to hospital and discovered that, because my family suffers from this, deep vein DVT, deep vein thrombosis, and it's below the knee. And the NHS trust here treats below the knee. Half the NHS trusts don't treat below the knee. And I was like thinking about this and thinking, how does that work?
Yeah.
I mean, so do you think that there should be this sort of mandated strategy across the whole of the NHS for, I don't mean specific situations like that, but the adoption of technology and other things? Is that what needs to happen?
I think increasingly, yes, I am thinking that. I think 10 years ago, me wouldn't have thought that.
Yeah.
But I think as I'm getting a bit older, probably a bit grumpier, but also just wanting to accelerate the opportunities that some of this stuff gives us. I think we're going to have to be a bit more explicit about, comply or explain. Because actually, the NHS can also sometimes be a bit afraid about picking winners. So I think when you're talking about products, so particular products, then people get jittery. Why this particular product, not that particular product? So I think when you talk about mandation, let's talk about mandating particular transformational pathway changes, of which there could be a multitude of different tech within that, or explain why your way of doing things gives the same outcomes for the same or better cash. So I think that kind of comply or explain regime is it. And I think if you can start setting the gold standard, then it's up to regions to say, we're doing it better, so we're fine, or we'll adopt your national gold standard.
So if management of the NHS says we need to adopt this technology, but the local trust says no, what happens?
Nothing happens. I mean, there's inertia. There's an appetite for risk that isn't perhaps as keen as it should be. And I think, there's one of the Royal Colleges, I think is a Royal College, has said, on average, it takes 17 years for something that's considered to be an innovation to be considered to be in mainstream use in the NHS. That's the kind of, obviously things are different. That's an average, but that's the kind of timeline you're talking about. Think about think about how we still use faxes in some parts of care provision. So,
are you kidding me?
Yeah. Or paper. So if you're there are still hospitals in this country where notes have to be passed from one site to another, and then maybe bundled onto the back of a taxi to be sent down the A1 to a particular hospital rather than being electronic, because we won't have electronic patient records in every single hospital. Now, they are becoming by far the small minority, but from an infrastructure point of view, that's where we are in some places in the NHS.
Is this inertia, is it a lack of understanding? Is it political? What?
I think it's very complicated. And I don't think none of it is due to people not wanting to do the right thing for patients. I think that's the most important thing to say. I think everybody who I've been doing this job now for 15 years. Everybody makes decisions based on their perspective of the best for their particular patients. But I guess the perspective of coming to those conclusions is where I'd probably have something to say. So there's quite a lot of not invented here, or it's different here, because there's quite a lot of can we accept an evidence base or a data set from a different part of the country? We need to run our own pilots. We have more pilots in the NHS than British Airways, because instead of just accepting proven evidence-based real-world evaluation, our kind of default is, well, let's test it, let's see, and then we'll scale it later.
Just out of interest, did COVID change?
Yeah.
And it did?
Yeah,
okay.
It did, massively. And I think, so we did a lot of work in COVID to, a lot of research to say, because all of a sudden things that took a decade took a week. So particularly thinking about things like the move to virtual online consultations.
Yeah.
The platform, the burning platform was white hot.
Yeah.
And the learning networks that sprung up, whether it was about clinicians in ICU testing things on a daily basis and being able to disseminate their learnings and their findings, and that being picked up and implemented by other clinicians throughout the country. The dissemination networks were amazing. Now, culturally, of course, you can see why that had to happen.
Yeah.
This is a crisis unlike no other. There are also some other factors that perhaps aren't replicable.
Yeah.
So I don't think we'll ever be in a time again where there's a blank check from the Treasury. I don't think we'll ever be in a time, hopefully not actually, in a time where there's one single challenge. So it did feel more like putting a man on the moon, like we're all pointing towards one goal rather than having 1,000 priorities every day. But there are loads of things that we identified culturally that are replicable. So the empowerment of frontline staff was greatly heightened. People making decisions. The visibility of leaders was another. The communication routes. So there's stuff that we could learn from. I think we did see a bit of the elastic sprung back a bit after COVID.
I was going to ask you.
Yeah. Okay. It was a shame, but I think after a time there was this general sense of, well, let's just get back to how things were. Now, I think some stuff has stuck.
Yeah.
I think we've broken the dam on things like virtual consultations, for example.
Yeah.
But culturally, I think I would have liked to retain more about that can-do attitudes that COVID taught us.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in business, in the private sector, we, suddenly, web meetings was a thing.
Yeah.
Working from home was a thing, and we jumped on it, and it is just not going to go back to what it was before in any way, shape, or form. And I was going to ask, actually, people like you would have said, right, okay, great. Suddenly, GPs can now do online consultations. We can triage really quickly. We can do early stage diagnosis, all of this stuff. How much of it? What percentage do you think, from your sort of helicopter view, has stayed, and what percentage has gone back?
I would say we're kind of 70 to 80% back in terms of how things used to be. I mean, I think one of the reasons for this is because it's something I argue about quite vociferously. Is I still believe there's a notion in the NHS that all pathways have to be accessible by all citizens. Yeah. When actually, I think we should have that plurality of choice, where digital for those who want to go digital, and actually freeing up face-to-face for those who need or want face-to-face. Because a lot of the arguments about going back that I heard and saw were digital's not for everyone, and it's like, and there are things that were missed. There are things that a clinician needs to be face-to-face in front of a patient to be able to see, not just hear, to be able to observe. That's where their skill, is really, years and years of expertise coming to the fore there. But that doesn't mean that if you've got a general consultation to have some follow-up about a blood test, that it can't be digital. So I think we need to stop throwing the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to change.
just before we move on to AI and something I'm very interested in, of course, and how that will impact the NHS, I wasn't going to ask you this, but I'm going to ask you. One of the things that I've been sort of fighting with in my as more as a mental challenge is that when Ferguson's model came out the first time, and he said that basically half the country were going to die if we didn't isolate, and we took a look at myself and colleagues looked at the code, and it was wrong. Like it was non-deterministic, which means that the algorithm would never work. And I questioned whether or not we should be doing this. And then the next bit of my thought process is, with artificial intelligence now and the models as good as they are, I'm not sure we would necessarily have locked down. How do you? And this is not supposed to be a political question; it's just more of a practical question. What do you think?
I'm probably going to take the fifth, given that it's not something I have much expertise on. But what I would say is, and this is just a layman's response, looking at the kind of stuff that's coming out of the inquiry that's happening now.
Yeah.
I would not be surprised if there is a general sense of, did we go too far with the lockdowns? That would be what I'd expect to see from the inquiry. But it's a layman's perspective rather than anything more professional than that. I think the interesting question societally is, if, heaven forbid, something akin to COVID happens again, have we got the ability to lock society down again? And I think from a security, from a civil obedience point of view, I would wonder what that would look like next time around.
Yeah, it must have been, really terrifying and confusing and hard work for the NHS at that moment. I mean, I've never seen anything like it anyway. So you're now on the MHRA National Commission, which looks after regulation of AI in healthcare.
Yeah.
Now, we were discussing earlier, I built my own digital twin of myself and I do my own diagnosis. And to be honest, I don't bother with GPs. I do, but I present my model to them. It's clear to me that AI could have a huge impact on the NHS. Where are we?
Well, I think we're starting to see it, actually. I think there's some real positives. I mean, one of the things I would say about AI is, when it comes to healthcare, I think it's wise to separate the notion of AI when it comes to clinical use cases.
Yeah.
So decision support tools in particular, I think right now, and AI when it comes to, let's call it back office productivity.
Yeah.
And I think we need to separate that, because actually the back office productivity argument, I think, is one. And now the question is, how do you go at it? What is there to go at? You're looking at things like ambient voice technology. I mean, there's a very live argument at the moment about whether ambient voice technology is a medical device or not. So that'll be depending on how the coin falls on that one, that'll be quite interesting. But right now, the productivity gains that clinicians in particular are seeing by the use of ambient voice tech are phenomenal. It's obviously, as you'll know, it allows the conversation to be listened to live in real life, and then is able to transcribe that into the medical record. It's able to write any letters to GPs and to the patients. It's able to order any tests that have been agreed on. But it also allows, so it doesn't just save the clinician the productivity time of the patient walks out and then it's like, dictate or turn around and tap into a computer. But it also actually, patient feedback. We're doing some great work with a company called Heidi in Hull at the moment. Patient feedback is the presence, the fact that the clinicians are present in the conversation, because they're not kind of spinning on a swivel chair to tap, 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 talk, tap, 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 talk. They're actually just here having a one-to-one conversation, knowing that everything is being captured. So ambient voice tech, both from a patient experience improvement tool and also from productivity kind of gains, I think is really huge. One of the biggest challenges I think we'll face from a regulation point of view is this the kind of the twin levers of safety and speed, and to a certain extent growth. How do we make sure that we're not stifling economic growth?
On the use of this, the tech industry, which I'm part of, has not helped itself particularly some of the social media guys and Google, etc., who were a little bit reckless with some of the stuff, particularly around Facebook and some of the manipulation of algorithms and all of that. We're now seeing companies like Palantir get close to the NHS. And even for somebody like me, you see, that Palantir would freak me out. How do you think about which vendors to use? And, while Palantir may have got great technology, we know it's also being used for military purposes right now, probably. You can't ever, but I think everybody pretty much knows it's being used to kill people. And those vendors like Palantir, we could develop this stuff ourselves in the UK. We have, DeepMind's number one, arguably, artificial intelligence, machine learning company in the world is from here. How much of that is an obstacle to getting technology into the NHS, and how do you think about that?
I think it can't be helpful. I think, Palantir is a really interesting test case. I think we're starting to see now, the politicians perhaps waking up to this, and the public certainly waking up to this, and lobby groups, etc. So I think that's got some way to run. It's well above my pay grade. I'm delighted to say, I was nowhere near the Palantir conversation and the federated data platform. Apologies, but I think,
well, good for you.
But to your point about how important is it for us to make sure that the public have trust in our vendors so that they continue to have trust in NHS. I think that's going to be something that has to be brought to the fore when it comes to future procurement. And also this point you made about, UK versus rest of the world. On our electronic patient records, we have some phenomenal US companies who, come in and deliver for the majority of NHS, but we also have some really interesting, domestic insurgents as well. And I think as the NHS starts to properly think through its role in terms of UK PLC economic growth, these kind of decisions, I think, have to be a little bit more strategic. So I think that will be a direction of travel in the future.
It could be, certainly the NHS is one of the biggest, if not the biggest employer in the United Kingdom, certainly in our region here, should be a critical role in my opinion, in generating economic activity. It could be. And the data set for people like us, for data science guys, that's just to die for. And the thought of allowing that data set to go really to US companies would just be devastating. There's so much that could be done with that data set, so many interesting things, models that could be built, that it really behooves us to look at this stuff. Where do you think AI can have the biggest impact in the next 5 years in the NHS, and what do you think it could actually do here?
So I think when you think about the challenges that the NHS has right now, they're all, we've got some really big, wicked operational challenges. Access, basically, in different shapes and forms, but access into services is probably the biggest challenge. Whether that's about access into primary care, people's inability to see a GP, whether that's about access into kind of elective care and the elective backlog. Access and capacity is our biggest problem. I think so. That's, for me, is where you can absolutely see that kind of AI, the first 5 years, if you like, of mainstreaming AI, really tackling that in terms of how it helps us to triage, how it helps us to remove maybe patients from different waiting lists. There's an amazing company called Pinpoint AI that we've worked with in Yorkshire for years and years and years. We've helped them to develop their product. They've got a machine learning tool which effectively takes previously taken blood tests, it analyzes them, and it's able to use an algorithm to determine if those patients should or shouldn't still be sat on a 2-week cancer wait time. And so what that means is, for patients who don't need to be on it, they get peace of mind, that you are hyper low risk, we can remove you from the list, you don't have to go and see a clinician. And of course, on the other side, you get patients who absolutely, sadly, need to be accelerated up that. Suddenly there's a capacity in the system for them to be seen sooner and earlier. So I think Pinpoint for me is a great example of how AI helps the triage. And so seeing the right patient in the right time, in the right setting, I think is really key.
One of the things at Yorkshire AI, one of the things that we model to is we think it makes an expert 20 to 25 times more productive.
Yeah.
Do you think that you can get to those metrics, similar metrics in the NHS?
I don't know what the ratio would be, but I think definitely in terms of productivity, I mean, the NHS, like the rest of the country, we are facing into our productivity challenge. I think there's an awful lot of places to go at.
Yeah.
With individual staff productivity. As I said, the back office, I think, is one of the biggest things. But then in terms of, you talk about going to your own clinician with your digital twin and potentially that, the knowledge differential now being quite stark. I think we've got to really think about how AI helps to inform clinicians, and actually sometimes even requires you not to have to see a clinician in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, I went to the Northern General Hospital because I was forced to go to the A&E department on a Saturday afternoon. Oh my God. I mean, I was told that I was going to be facing 6 hours. I had to sit there for 6 hours before somebody could see me. And I was looking at what they were doing and I was thinking, I could implement AI here in like 5 minutes and it would solve this weight problem. Now, maybe I'm probably massively oversimplifying. Are we facing the problem that you alluded to earlier, that there's inertia to change as quickly as is necessary to solve, because these problems are solvable now, I think. And how can we get over it?
I think there's definitely elements of that inertia, worry and anxiety as well.
Yeah.
I think, AI requires a workforce that is trained and knowledgeable and has the skills to be able to handle it and understand it. I think it also requires patients and citizens who trust it and understand what it's doing for them. I don't think we're doing anywhere near as much as we need to bring both staff and patients and citizens on board with the AI journey. So that, I think, is the point number one. Because if not, we're going to be building things that people just don't use. And I think that's really, really key. And, it goes back to use of data. It goes back to, people's fears about particular vendors. So we've got to get into that, because otherwise everything else we do is going to be pretty pointless. But I think one of the, I'm always quite challenging, I think, in rooms when I'm trying to get people to do different things. And obviously when you think about AI as a decision support software or other use cases, safety is one of the first things that people bring up. But nobody ever asks the question of how safe are we right now?
Yeah, exactly.
And so we are treating AI, I think, as a unique individual kind of test, rather than trying to balance it against current practice. And so nothing in the NHS is 100% safe. And yet we kind of assume that status quo is status quo, and that's perfectly fine. Rather than ask ourselves some more, I would say, important questions, such as, what's the differential of risk compared to how we do things now, compared to how an AI augmented service would allow us to deliver care?
Well, my example of this is I had a family member that had a suspected stroke, and I went and sat in the hospital with them. And as they were coming in and out doing various tests, I built an AI model in Gemini, actually, that was a closed model. So it was specific for this task. And when the consultant came round, and I said to her, based on these stats that I've got, the anticoagulation medication appears to be wrong. Given kidney function, it could be this, and the statin dose has been arbitrarily reduced by the GP, and it should be this. And she was like, whoa, let me give you a minute. They had to go away with pen and paper to do the calculations. Yeah. And then came back and said, how the hell did you know that? Are you from the medical industry? It's like, no, I'm definitely not. But is some of this inertia because doctors, specialists have gone through all of this training, through the books, remembering everything, and an AI model is an equivalent to 20,000 of them? Is some of it because doctors genuinely just don't want to feel like they're being commoditized, their knowledge is being commoditized?
I'm certain that it is. I really am. And I think, and also sometimes with good reason as well, because whatever, I mean, you're the expert on this, but we all know that the professional class will have a change in status over the next decade and a half or so. and the democratization of professions that AI is going to bring, whether you're a lawyer, doctor, architect, whatever you may be. That, I think, is something that culturally we have to really understand, and I'm not sure that we have yet. But then also from a legal point of view, you really, and this is where the regulatory role, the Commission has some amazing conversations. In a world of agentic AI, in a world of advanced general intelligence, who's actually responsible for care? And I think that's where a doctor's training would kick in and say, I am responsible for this person's care.
Yeah.
And actually, if something goes wrong and there's a medical council tribunal, I'm going to be the one stood there arguing for care. And I think we haven't yet, squared the circle, particularly when it comes to agentic AI, about so who's legally responsible for these decisions that are being made. And I think that's where I think there's good reason for pause until we figure this all out.
One of the big prizes actually is something I know which is very close to what you really care about, which is inequality.
Yeah.
And outcome expectation associated with healthcare. First of all, talk a little bit about that and then how technology can maybe bridge some of those gaps.
Yeah. So I think over the last 5 or 6 years, I think the NHS has really properly understood its leadership role when it comes to health inequalities. I think, we see it operationally in terms of waiting times, not just being about the chronological order in which we're placed on a list, but actually in terms of thinking about the deprivation, thinking about the need, the urgency, all those kind of things. But then also thinking about accessibility of services. And I think that's particularly where I think technology has a massive role to play. We see it already. I mean, we'll talk about this, I'm sure, but from a digital divide point of view, there's definitely a danger that the more tech you throw into a system, the more you're going to exacerbate health inequalities. And that's absolutely true. And we can talk about what the mitigations are for that. But equally, plenty of examples out there of where you use amazing tech that's user-friendly, designed around patients. Screening services is a really good example of that. And actually, you're getting communities coming forward for health service interventions who normally have been missed out. And I think there was some really good examples of how tech is an enabler of health inequality reduction.
Tech it has this ability to make the divide wider, and it can be used to make it smaller, but you have to make it available to absolutely everyone. I mean, there was an interesting. I was listening to Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, last night. He said that there seems to be a ceiling on worldwide GDP of about 100 trillion. AI, he believes, can take that to 200 to 300 trillion. Now, one thesis is that gets shared equally among everybody, and we all benefit. But there's the other, which is the Elon Musk's and the Jensen Huangs, actually, because of what they're doing, to take most of it. How do you avoid, particularly in healthcare, just the haves benefiting and the have-nots not benefiting? What kind of systems can you put in place to?
Yeah, and I think that's where you have to, back to this point about the BBC and the NHS being so precious. If you were going to say that that divergence is coming, and the Elons of the world are going to kind of somehow get on the accelerated path, there's nowhere I'd want to be other than a country that has a universal healthcare system. So I think that's the point number one is, we have to make sure that we protect absolutely this notion of free at the point of delivery, universal healthcare for all. That is the best way of doing it. But then I think in terms of more granularly, how do you actually get into this? I think you've got to really know your population health. And I think it's something that the NHS is getting towards. How do you actually create healthcare interventions at a population level that's going to make sure that the people most in need are the ones who benefit the most? And how do you also have the business case to say that's what we need economically as well? So it's not about, robbing Peter to pay Paul, but it's actually about saying we absolutely need to focus on lifting those people out who need the most help, because that's the greatest impact on all society.
Well, that feels like a natural place to pause part one. We've covered the mechanics of innovation, AI, and we're going to get into more of the digital divide. In part 2, we're going to move beyond the NHS into something much bigger. Why Richard Stubbs believes health is now one of Britain's biggest economic growth issues, why Yorkshire could become one of the world's most important health innovation regions, and why the future of the NHS may depend on far more than hospitals and doctors. Thank you.
You know the kind of conversations we have here, honest, ambitious, and focused on what's really shaping the future of UK industry. Now, imagine taking them even further. That's exactly what the Digital Forge membership is about. This isn't just another network, it's a proving ground where connection, knowledge, and opportunity collide. As a member, you'll unlock exclusive events and curated networking with serious builders, a private community platform for real-time support, and a content and knowledge hub packed with insights you won't find anywhere else. Plus, you'll gain access to exclusive discounts and the chance to learn directly from mentors and seasoned founders who've already walked the path. Everything we do is built on trust, clarity and intent. No noise, no theatre, just the right conditions for progress. So if you're ready to join the future of UK industry and step into a community built to accelerate growth, join other members at forgedforgrowth.com.